Hello everybody, welcome to the closing plenary of the Museum Exhibition Design Histories and Futures Conference. I'm Dr. Claire Wintle, one of the conveners of the conference. I'm a principal lecturer in Museum Studies and Design History here at the University of Brighton. I work within the Centre for Design History and I lead the Centre's research into the relationships between design, museums, archives and exhibitions, and it's absolutely wonderful to have so many of you tuning in to this event today. So we're absolutely thrilled to be able to share with you our four fabulous speakers calling in from London, Penzance, Boston and Ahmedabad. Diana Cassand, Ian Elzner, Tamina Goska and Ashok Chatterjee are going to share with us their reflections on the histories and futures of museum exhibition design from their varied critical and professional perspectives. Now, I think most of you know that the main aim of the conference was to move behind the scenes of the museum to understand the activities, agendas, experience and impact of museum exhibition makers. So I'm absolutely delighted that we can be joined by such an inspiring set of people who are doing such important and interesting things for design and for museums. So I'm champing at the bit to introduce them to you properly, but first I'd like to say a few words of thanks. The conference has been entirely asynchronous, with pre-recorded papers made available over 2 weeks, and the Q&A discussion boards have been really lively, which has been lovely to see, but it feels quite special to be all together in the same airspace in a conference that's otherwise been quite diffuse. So I do want to thank the important people who've made the conference possible while we're all here together. And you'll have to excuse me. After 2 weeks, or actually 2 months of quite high pressured labour, this has the potential to go on, go full on Paltrow at the Oscars, but I'll try and hold it together. So first, I'd like to thank colleagues at the Centre for Design History, in particular our administrators, Georgina Librulli and Ian Sinclair, and Professor Jeremy Ainsley and Dr. Annabella Pollen for their support. I'm also very grateful to Cara, Sveti and Cameron, who are holding my hand for this event behind the scenes, ensuring it runs smoothly. I'm delighted to be able to thank Dr. Tim Satterthwaite, who put together the conference website so beautifully. His own Future States Nearly Carbon Neutral conference, which ran in April of this year, was the inspiration for the Museum Exhibition Design Conference, and Tim has been an incredible source of knowledge and expertise these past few months. Most importantly, I'd like to thank Kate Guy and Hadra Williams, my wonderful PhD students and the co-conveners of this conference. When they agreed last year to help me run a very small one-day symposium with perhaps, 5 or 6 speakers, they never dreamed it would turn into this 11-day event with 500 delegates and 58 papers delivered from speakers all over the globe. I distinctly remember Hadra asking, who's going to come to this thing? Well, 1 year later, a global pandemic, 2 fantastic keynotes in Suzanne MacLeod and Andrea Whitcomb, and an incredible response to our call for papers. The remit of the project has indeed changed somewhat. And so, we've been absolutely delighted with the enthusiasm for this project, but it has brought an incredible technological, intellectual and time commitment, especially from Kate and Hadra. And I really just do want to thank them for the good humour, resourcefulness and enthusiasm that they've brought to the project. And in fact, looking at the titles of some of the panels of the conference, there does seem to be several links between our subject and our project. So I was thinking total immersion, crisis, collaboration, they all seem to be particularly apt. And I also wanted to thank our presenters, including our keynotes and plenary speakers. We've asked a huge amount of them to record their papers in unfamiliar formats, to subtitle them where possible to support access, and then to give us their attention and their time over the 2 weeks of the conference. So we've been privileged to hear wonderful research from professors and prominent designers, but also master's students beginning their career. And we've benefited from hearing perspectives from all over the world. And I've been especially touched by those who could join us from maternity leave and even a quarantine hotel room in Shanghai. And in these distant times, I was struck by the intimacy and collegiality I encountered through the many emails, through the papers and in the forums as well. So thank you very much, all of you indeed. But now I would like to turn things over to our speakers. Each of our plenary speakers will talk for 5 minutes or so, and then I'll open the floor to you, the audience. We're really looking forward to your questions and your comments, and you can submit these through the Q&A chat function, in which you're very welcome, indeed strongly encouraged, to ask questions. So ask those at any time, the sooner the better actually, and then I can gather them together and feed them to the speakers towards the end of the presentations. And questions can be for individual speakers or for the whole panel, or comments about the conference overall. So finally, we're extremely privileged to welcome Dinah Cassand Cbe to this session. Dinah set up her design practice in 1970 and her partnership with Roger Mann in 1984. And Cassand Mann have designed an incredible range of museums and exhibitions, from object-based British galleries at the V&A through to the highly technological First World War galleries at the Imperial War Museum. They also designed the groundbreaking Endeavour galleries for the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. And during the last 25 years, they've worked on projects across Europe, Russia, the US and the Middle East. In 2006, with Roger Mann, Dinah was elected to the extremely prestigious Faculty of Royal Designers for Industry, and amongst many other things, she's Deputy Chairman of Town Eastbourne and a Trustee of the Royal Fine Art Commission Trust. And since the 1970s, she's taught at a number of design schools and is an Honorary Fellow of the Royal College of Art and of the RIBA as well. She was awarded a CBE in 2018, and her forthcoming book, Closed on Mondays, Behind the Scenes at the Museum, will be published by London Hunsfreys later this year, and it's already on my Christmas list. And Dinah, we're absolutely delighted to have you with us. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Claire. That was very sweet of you. And thank you also for inviting me to speak this session. And I want to congratulate everybody. I'm sure we'll all be saying this, but I do congratulate you on this whole project. I think it's been extraordinary, and I think it's a really interesting prototype for a future low carbon format conference, which is really very interesting. And I thought that the papers, I didn't listen to all of them obviously, but you know, 20 minutes doesn't sound like a lot, but I mean, people managed to get in a lot, and there was some really useful thoughts and ideas. During lockdown, I have been finishing off this book, which is really just a sort of collection of essays about aspects of museums which have intrigued and irritated me, such as why so many picture frames in our galleries are grossly misleading, why coat checks might possibly be the most important part of a museum, why there is such suspicion about facsimiles, and a few other things. And but during this time, I've had time to consider these things, and that's the great privilege. There are no conclusions, of course, you'll be glad to hear. So essentially, I feel I'm a practitioner, and listening to the papers of this conference, I was struck yet again by the chasm really that lies between theory and practice, which is nothing new, but it sort of saddens me a bit. And when you listen to the interviews with John Old, Nima Hoover-Smith, Alex McCraig, and even Stephen Greenberg, alongside the research presentations, the gap is visible. It's about language and it's about understanding, I think. And it's only a point worth mentioning because there's such a lot of knowledge here. There's such a lot of wisdom, which has been generously shared. But the problem is finding how to put these ideas into practice, how to transfer some of that thinking into practice and inform practice. Why doesn't this happen? Time and money. But there is some curious thing which I've tripped up over a number of times in institutions and museums and within designers, is a real difficulty in learning from other places, and also museums find it very difficult to learn from themselves. So it meant that Matt Isbell's paper about this was particularly interesting to me, and I recommend it to those who missed it, because he offers very simple and straightforward methods of transference, and he's identified an issue which I think is critical. So time and money is a legitimate excuse because everyone's working on a project and they've just got to get on with it. And if you have the budgets of Qatar, which we heard about, I mean, jolly nice, and then there's a bit of space there, but most of us don't have that. And we also know that no two projects are the same, no narrative, no museum culture, no audience, no topic is the same as any other. And that's always a slight reason for feeling, well, it's so different, we don't have to. So that we can reinvent the wheel again, because it's more fun. and we don't have to look over our shoulder. But as somebody pointed out and referred us back to my old mate Emilio Ambas, looking back to see ahead is wisdom indeed, but it's hard for practitioners. And I think really what it's about is being more humble and more ingenious. In addition to these searches for ways to learn, I have 3 thoughts about the future of exhibition design, which I'll just share with you. For a better normal, if I can use that phrase. One is about trust. And trust is something that museums have managed to hold on to. They are still regarded as trustworthy institutions, and all other institutions, I think, have blown it. So this brings a high level of responsibility to those of us who practice in museums. It means that museums have to be thoughtful, and they have to be sensitive, and they have to be truthful as they can be. Now, the next few years are going to be hideous. We've got huge bills to pay, and I suspect museums are going to be badly hit with research and knowledge thinned in favour of glitzy, crowd-pulling exhibitions and so on. But we as designers and curators have to find a way of responding to this. And I think, again, we have to be careful, we have to be creative, we have to be responsible, we have to be resourceful. We have to listen, and we have to listen, and we have to listen again to our clients, and particularly to our visitors, and we have to read between their lines. I also think that as installations cost so much money, and institutions are forced to retain them for that reason, probably for longer than they want and probably than they should. So I think we have to make installations that embody affordable and constant change, making them capable of responding to changing histories and changing feelings. A lot can be done with labels. And I enjoyed Kate Bell's presentation about labels because she had that lovely story about the Beam engine on display in Edinburgh that's had 40 different labels since it first went. I mean, this is interesting, and it's quite right. And it seemed to me that when we were pulling down all our statues, and still are trying to pull down statues, a lot could be solved. A lot of the problems could be solved with changing the label. And that's perhaps a separate issue. But I think labels are key to lots and lots and lots of things. Same time, we have to remember that the installations that we make as designers should be beautiful. And they have to be places of respite, of venture and safety that anticipate visitors' needs before they realise them, and to make them feel enriched when they leave. The second point I wanted to make is about waste. I think each temporary exhibition we make and trade show results in waste which shames our profession. We have to make products, inventions, recycling kits that designers can feel they can run with. And do we have to start from scratch every time? I don't think so. So it's not just the specification, it's to do with what happens next. And the last and third point I wanted to make is about travel. I think we and objects will travel less, certainly for long enough for the implications of this to become real. So the digital world, both filmic and in the form of 3D facsimiles, will allow us to rethink place, rethink authenticity, and the movement of objects and people. Lockdowns forced museums to explore their online world at speed, but being in touch with the visceral has clearly been something that people have missed. Maybe then, Claire, your next conference has to be about how we can separate out authentic from the essential. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Dinah. That was fantastic. And given that facsimiles and models and replicas are amongst my 3 favourite things in museums, I'm really looking forward both to listening to your and reading your book, but also looking forward to that prediction becoming true. I think it's got great potential as well. Thank you. And some other lovely things in there as well. So next up, I'm very happy to introduce Ian Elzner. Ian is a technologist and programmer making museum exhibits for Richard Lewis Media Group. And his interactive exhibits are featured in places like the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21 in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and Idaho State Museum and the Infinity Centre in Mississippi. Ian also hosts the podcast Museum Archipelago, which is where we came across him, you see. And it's one of the largest podcasts about the museum world. And over the course of 80 episodes, Museum Archipelago has visited and reported on museums all over the globe. So it's a real pleasure to have you with us today, Ian.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I'm really excited to be here. And first off, I just want to thank all of you organizers of the conference. It was truly fantastic. It was the first asynchronous conference I've been to, and it was just really cool. It worked really well, and it also had the best coffee of any conference I've ever been to. So thanks for knowing exactly what I wanted. But no, it's been wonderful. So while watching the talks, I found myself trying to tie back to the only thing that I'm familiar with, digital interactives in museums. Dina talked about the chasm between theory and practice, and I'm sort of interested in interrogating, as some of the talks did, sort of where digital interactives fit in with, or interactives in general, fit in with just place-based or physical structures. So, as Claire mentioned, I host Museum Archipelago, and every 2 weeks I visit a different museum all around the world and report on the tremendous amount of unchecked cultural power that museums wield, simply by being museums. And the topics discussed on the show mirror some of the things discussed on this conference, much less articulately and expertly, of course, but the podcast is how I look at some of these themes and how they actually make their way into museums. I was really struck by Jana Peel's talk about graphic design as critical practice and Beatriz Martinez Sosa's example about designing to decolonize. Specifically that it's not working harder, it's about the process of the work itself. And I wanted to share an anecdote from the software world, because we come up against some of the same problems in software. In software development, there's a phrase called deceptive patterns. Some people call it dark patterns. And basically, as making museum exhibits, we're never too far from sort of these dark design patterns. A good example that everyone will be familiar with is the unsubscribe button on an email. You know, something teeny tiny and low contrast. It's clear that no one wants you to hit that unsubscribe button. And so I'm sort of interested, because everyone here is so good at sort of thinking critically about the process, what that looks like for museum interactives. And deception isn't all that bad. Timothy McNeil's presentation made the point that digital interactives can fit into the museum designer's box of tricks. Sometimes you want those smoke and mirrors depending on the story you're trying to tell. Daria Gradslova made some great points about how not all interactive museums are digital experiences, how digital experiences must exist together with the non-digital exhibition. But for all of its similarities, museum software is also fundamentally different from other kinds of museum work, specifically in what you can do remotely. And yes, I think this is going to become more and more common as we go forward, as was just mentioned. Of course, by remotely, we mean what many of us have done since the start of the pandemic. Museums sort of resist remote work, I feel, because so many are tied to a place. If a memorial museum wasn't in that specific place, in Churchill's war bunker, it might not give visitors the same experience. So much of the conference, even though it's remote, is about the design of physical space that shapes the experience. And software is fundamentally different. And so where it intersects museums, there's this interesting remote possibility. What if your software could be produced, developed, and installed by someone a continent away? Matt Isbly's talk on fostering institutional knowledge shows us the importance of documenting those physical installs and how sort of taxing that can be for a museum. But it's now possible to do remote installs, and I know because I've done them. Over the past several months, I've installed software in galleries across the country. While I was sitting in my apartment in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I was installing a museum in Sacramento, California, and of course, I still haven't visited that gallery. Because the computer on the exhibit floor is networked, I or anyone on the team can remote into the touchscreen or projector or digital table and install a new version of the software. It really is like a window into the gallery. In fact, if a visitor does come up and start using the touchscreen, I can actually see the ghosts of their touches on the screen. It's wild. It's wild. And of course, on the production side, this also works. Teams can share software back and forth, make prototypes that you can test on a home laptop. And as Isabella Derda, Zoe Popoli, and Tom Futstel said in their talk, this type of model focuses on calibration. That's exactly what happened. I'm actually in Sofia, Bulgaria right now. Down the street, there's the first children's museum in the Balkans called Museko was open. The design teams that worked on that, including Paul Orselli, did so in the US and Europe. Software developers could share what they were working on across the ocean. And you combine that with the ability to update information instantly, update the label, update the digital label. I really look forward to see what a conference like this will talk about digital interactives a few years from now. And that's it for me. Thanks so much.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Ian. And I didn't know you were in Bulgaria. That's great. That means I've got another country on my list. That's fantastic.
Well, Claire, I wasn't when we were doing the technical setup, so okay. I was worried you would.
No, it's great. I'm delighted. I hope you're okay over there. That's great that you can join us. And thank you for those really interesting reflections. I'm especially interested in that relationship between the physical space and then the remote strangeness of some of the things that we've been doing recently. So it's really nice to hear you reflect on that. Thank you very much. Great. There is one question in the live Q&A. So that means that, well, thank you very much to that person, but it would be nice to have a few more. So do please keep them coming, both for individual presenters and also for the panel as a whole. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Tamina Goska. She's the Director and Curator of the Curatorial Research Centre in the UK and has nearly 20 years experience working in research, exhibitions and programming in a variety of settings, from national museums to pop-up shops. She's a fellow of the Museums Association and a member of its ethics committee, so a very important job, and an accredited member of the Association of Facilitators and a research associate at Swansea University. She's the programme leader and creator of Citizen Curators, a work-based curatorial training programme for volunteers that was developed in collaboration with Cornwall Museums Partnership and supported by the Esme Fairbairn Collections Fund. She's also the co-founder and co-organiser of Twitter's Museum Hour, which, for those of you who don't know, it's an online forum that brings together people from across the world, across institutions, and importantly across career stages and kind of hierarchies within museums as well. And it's been really inspiring for us in terms of the Museum Design History Conference to see the work that Tamina's been doing there as well. So thank you very much for being here, Tamina.
Wow, that's quite an introduction. Thank you so much, Claire. And I just want to heap my thanks on to the conference organisers, the producers as well behind the scenes, all the presenters. I've had such fun over the last few days, dipping in and out of papers in all sorts of unusual locations in my house and outside. So it's been a very exciting kind of conference interaction. And also to my fellow panelists, it's just always a real privilege to hear from other people in your field, but maybe we don't get to speak with each other very often. And thank you also for this opportunity to reflect. So my philosophy on good curating is all about balance. It's a balance between knowledge creation and communication. And I'm working up some kind of analogy which I hope will make sense. If you imagine knowledge as being like a caravan of camels, and this should make sense when I get to the end. All of the themes of this conference have made me really look back at my own practice and my own history and put that in the context of the big issues that we're facing today. And I find myself exploring this professional history through my senses. I can't actually remember a single word I've written for an exhibition, and I've written thousands, but I do remember the feel, the smell, and the movement I have helped to create. I remember the light on the art, the objects and the specimens, and the shadows and shapes they create, and I remember the colours. For me, an exhibition or a display is an opportunity not just to show and show off, but to say something as an artist, an institution, as a curator, a community, or a collective. When you realise you have come away from an exhibition unmoved or none the wiser, is it you with the problem or the museum? We are questioning every stage, facet and process in museums right now, and certainly the worldwide lockdown and pandemic has given us this very big collective opportunity to do so. We're even questioning, and we're falling out over the very definition of a museum's purpose, and even whether exhibitions are the way forward. The truly memorable exhibition feeds the soul and should last. But over my career, I too have fallen foul of privileging the righteousness of professional museum and design practices over the actual living needs of our communities and audiences. My work curating over 30 exhibitions and collections events and more besides has always sought to enhance the intimacy that you can create between the exhibit and its beholder. So a memory can be formed, and good human-centered design is so instrumental in this and personally very important to me. But who do we imagine we're doing this all for? The nuclear family who wants to press buttons and spin things around, the retired couple who will read everything but want some peace and quiet, the tourist who wants to tick it off their bucket list. Our common contribution to being inclusive in exhibitions are ramps and turning circles for wheelchair users and large print versions of our very many labels. We put up respectful signs asking for forbearance because of the protective darkness in which we shroud our exhibits. Do not touch, obviously. But how have we as curators and exhibition designers been complicit in designing for the default supremacies in society while continuing to marginalize the marginalized? Let's take responsibility for our prejudices, and let's be more open when we talk and write about them, as so very many presentations in this conference are already starting to do. This prejudice we have to confront and we have to talk about. How have we as curators and exhibition designers been complicit in designing first and foremost for sound bites, the flashy budget-busting boasts, the gimmicks, sometimes betrayed by questionable content and slapdash story making? The earth is heaving right now because of our egos and our wastefulness. Suppressed and marginalized by the attention paid to these celebrity blockbusters and eye-wateringly expensive capital redevelopments, the real diversity of talent and their originality in the exhibition world seem now to be really emerging strongly. And this is something that I really want to emphasize. These creators are speaking directly to our souls and helping us all ask why and how. Yet in spite of past attitudes and behaviours, and in spite of the problematic world we have helped to create, there must still be something in museums and exhibitions that we love and care about, and we're not quite ready to let it go. So all of this that I've just said and reflected on has found expression in a poem that I'd like to share and end with. And it's by the Sufi master Hafez, and it's called Someone Untied Your Camel, and goes something like this. And the translation I'm using is by Daniel Ladinsky. I cannot sit with my countrymen in chains. I cannot act mute, hearing the world's loneliness, crying near the beloved's heart. My dear, is your caravan lost? It is if you can no longer be kind to yourself and loving to those who must live with the sometimes difficult task of loving you. And that's my camel that has become untied. So thank you very much.
How fantastic. Thank you ever so much. That was extremely beautiful and moving. And just that call to privilege audiences and move beyond ego is something that's so important, and I have to say that's something that I have been thinking about over the last few weeks. So thank you for putting it so beautifully and eloquently. So thank you. We have had some more questions in the Q&A. I'm absolutely delighted to say. Do keep them coming. Again, for individuals or for the panel as a whole, it's really nice to hear from you all. So last but not least, I cannot tell you how pleased I am to welcome Professor Ashok Chatterjee to this event. Ashok worked for 25 years at India's National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad, where he was Executive Director, Senior Faculty, Distinguished Fellow and Professor of Communication and Management. He's had a very wide-ranging career serving development institutions in India and overseas, particularly in the sectors of livelihoods, crafts, drinking water, sanitation, education and disability, as well as working with artisans in many parts of India. He was Honorary President of the Crafts Council of India for over 20 years, and he's served on the Board of Aid to Artisans in the US. An author and writer, his books include Dances of the Golden Hall, On the Art of Shanta Rao, and Rising on Empowerment Efforts amongst Communities in Rural Gujarat. Professor Chatterjee continues to assist design education, and he is an advisor at Ahmedabad University Centre for Heritage Management. And I also just wanted to say that Professor Chatterjee is an incredibly generous individual. I've had the pleasure to be in communication with Ashok for a number of years now, and I've been struck by his support for emerging scholars and practitioners and his energy and enthusiasm for exploring design and design history. So thank you very much for joining us. It's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you to the organizers of this incredible conference. I think that all those who study and should be studying exhibition design will have the most extraordinary resource of material and of thought that will enrich their education and their practice for years to come. I myself am staggered by the range of contributions that have come. Such incredible information that China is now putting together 200 new museums, right to the issues of displaced cultural property, war museums, and so much else that you have shared with us over these past days. I think one of the things that is worrying me at this moment, but let me backtrack a minute. One of the things that is encouraging me at this moment is that for the very first time since this COVID lockdown, I'm hearing of people who are saying, I wish I could go to a gallery or a museum. I've absolutely never heard that before, but I'm hearing it now. And when I hear this, I ask myself, particularly when I'm listening to the contributions that so many of your friends have made at this conference, what is the value of the museum or the exhibition, and where is the evidence of that value that can be put in front of those who will make decisions and who will be signing the checks in the post-COVID period? Because the indications here are that once again, matters of culture will be seen as soft, dispensable, and things that can be postponed. So this worries me, and it strikes me that perhaps the time has come for the value of what we are talking about, for the evidence to be put on the table so that people who are outside this profession of design and communication and museums and exhibitions can actually understand and appreciate the transformational value that exhibitions and museums have played in recent years. Perhaps we've been taking them for granted just too long. And I say that from a position of having been associated, as you mentioned, with the National Institute of Design. We would not have happened, perhaps, or at least not in the same way, but for an exhibition that took place at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1955. That's where conversations that took place initiated the National Institute of Design. And then Charles and Ray Eames turned up in Ahmedabad and created their first biographical exhibition, Jawaharlal Nehru and his India, on which the entire, every discipline, the entire faculty of NID was trained. Have we actually understood the value of that? Because that exhibition, that great exhibition, was given a permanent place in New Delhi, and a few months ago was bulldozed. It doesn't exist today. Nobody knows where it is. And yet that exhibition is the seed from which contemporary Indian design through NID was sown. So again, one wonders, where is the value? It was bulldozed without any resistance from the design community. Nobody cared, and nobody to this day knows where that is. But I know how important it was. And I also know that the exhibition medium at NID gave us opportunities that we would never have dreamt of otherwise. For example, we immersed ourselves in agriculture because we were given an opportunity to do a national exhibition on agriculture. Design had not entered that space until exhibition brought all these disciplines together, and we were there because we were exhibition designers. But what we learned was about India's largest industry, and it transformed the way we taught and functioned from that day forward. In 2001, we had a horrific pogrom in Ahmedabad. And today, in a corner of the city, a designer about 3 or 4 years ago put together in a small building in the heart of the area most affected by violence, she put together what she calls the Conflictorium, a museum of peace. And this museum has managed to survive and to thrive without any objection, although it raises hugely sensitive issues, right on ground zero. And it is looked after and cared for by the communities who live around it, which include bootleggers, makers, sellers of shoes, sellers of birds, a Catholic church, a mosque, a temple. Now, once again, I ask myself, who else except an exhibition designer would have had the imagination and the guts to do what Avni Sethi did as her diploma project in her design school in Bangalore, and to realize that? Just now, so much of the discussion that has taken place has been about the digital medium. And at Ahmedabad University, a scholar of environment and specifically of water is putting together a digital, universal, global water museum, which before the COVID crisis had already begun to encourage the kind of discussion about national resource management and about water scarcity, which would have been impossible without such an actual experience, which she has been able to take to people on their computers and on their phones, not requiring them to be out, and which has flourished during the COVID pandemic. So in all these ways, I see the value and the transformational power of what you and your colleagues have been talking about. And I ask that this evidence somehow be brought together in a way that those who control policies, who control decision-making, and who control budgets can finally wake up to the fact that what we're talking about is not at the margins of development, but at the heart of development. And that COVID enables us to understand that. We're doing this in a country where only a few months ago, one of our greatest craft museums was told overnight in a 2-line communication that would no longer get grants from the government of India. I'm telling this, I'm repeating this, that our National Museum, which is more than 200 years old, celebrated its bicentennial without any recognition and caring from the country it has served for 200 years. That museum in Calcutta, the Indian Museum, carries the local name of Jadughar, which means the house of magic. And that's a term we need to bring back, and to understand that these houses and spaces of magic are what make us human, and that will help us to survive not just COVID, but all the other crises which are surely around the corner for us. Thank you, and thank you very much for including me once again.
Thank you very much, Ashok. And it's a bit of a shame that I can see the speakers on my screen. I know that you can't, but they're all clapping wildly with their mics on. But it's really well, very interesting to hear that. I was extremely I hadn't realised that about the Crafts Museum, and I'm sorry to hear about the state of the Indian Museum as well. They're such important institutions, and also touched by your call to show the value of the profession. And I think, you know, Kate Hadra and I are talking about potential publications and other kind of outputs from this conference. Obviously, we have the conference website, but I think working with practitioners to think about ways in which we can take some of this material to support that call, probably in a small way, is something that we're very keen to do. So thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so we've got questions, guys. We've got 14. So that's exciting. Actually, a couple of them already picked up some of those themes that you were just talking about, Ashok, about especially about the Nehru, the textiles exhibition at MoMA in the 40s, and how critical that has been for NID, but also for the museum sector more broadly. And one of the questions that came up in the chat was about a standout exhibition that changed the profession, or changed the ways in which visitors and designers do their work. So I wondered if the panel wanted to comment on that, about the idea of a standout exhibition. We've heard some of Ashok's standout exhibitions. You might have a different one to share, but it'd be really interesting, I think, to hear the other panelists maybe say a few words about their standout exhibition. I don't know who wants to go first. Is anybody champing at the bit? Can raise
I'm happy to go first.
Thanks.
Yeah, brilliant. I think it's always difficult when people ask this question, which comes up so many times. And I find also now that I'm sort of teaching and training other people to create exhibitions and all sorts of other things, this question keeps coming up. You know, what's the best exhibition you've seen, or what sort of stands out and why? And for me, if I was sort of pressed, there's sort of two examples where I felt, genuinely transformed, not by the physicality necessarily, or the physicality of the space has certainly helped, but the new Estonian National Museum in Tartu, which is the second city of Estonia, and it opened, I believe, about 4 years ago. I've been back twice. Very sad that haven't been able to visit this year. But what was striking about it was this is a museum that needed to create a national identity. And, you know, in this current era of nationalism, it's very difficult to do in an inclusive way. But if there's any museum that has actually achieved that inclusivity of, quotes, ordinary people, it is that museum. There is no timeline, teleological timeline of this is where we started, this is where we are now. Every exhibit, and I should say, beautifully put together and so creatively, is a story of an ordinary person. There's no stories of famous people. And for me, for a national museum to take that approach, I think says an awful lot about their society and culture's desire to be inclusive, but to be able to assert identity in a positive rather than in a weaponized way. So I think for me that standout would be, it is very much predicated on the on that intention, and that the intention behind those curatorial decisions and the design. There is another example, but I won't take up more time to go into that. So handing over to someone else.
Thank you. Dinah, would you like to go next?
I think this is a very mean question, but one, because I think that the different exhibitions hit you at different moments in your life, and they touch you in different ways. I mean, one of the questions which we in a group of colleagues from Europe, we had a sort of seminar together. I mean, one of the questions I was asking is it possible for an exhibition to make you cry? And there is one exhibition that made me cry, which, and I sense in that sense it was memorable, which was an exhibition at the Royal Academy in London about Van Gogh's letters that he wrote to his brother. And it was mixed in with some of his paintings, but paintings were somehow less touching than these extraordinary letters, which were displayed in a sort of darkish room. So that's a crying experience. A joyous experience has been in Italy, up in the mountains of Carrara, where there's a little museum made by a marble worker, which I use quite a lot in lectures and things. It's a bit like, there's a funny cafe in London called Cafe Italia, which designers love because no designer's been anywhere near it. And it's the same with this little museum. It's a sort of untouched virgin place. Of course, the man who made it is a designer, but he isn't called a designer. It's just extraordinarily direct, and it's something about his voice that comes straight through. I mean, his museum is made in the marble quarry, so his walls are marble, and he carves into it the text, and he writes text on cardboard and knocks it in the walls. So, graphic designers eat your heart out. It's just a sort of way of this directness. And the only other place I would mention is a little museum in a city in northern France called Troyes, which is an installation in an old orphanage, which had taken in boys, I think, really, into this orphanage, and they were taught different trades. And so there's this installation, I think it's 64 display cases, and in each display case, everything needed for a particular trade has been placed, but it's been placed with sort of somehow a theatrical eye, and there's no text. My dream museum, no text actually. And there it is, and you completely get it just in one eyeful. It's amazing, and unfortunately a designer was behind that, but anyway, there you go.
It's okay, it doesn't matter that a designer was behind that. That's a good thing. Ian, did you want to come in?
Sure. These are great examples, and I have one small one to add. I did an episode on the Tiagara Museum in Devonport, Tasmania, Australia. This was a museum about the Six Rivers Aboriginal Corporation or Nation in Tasmania, but it was opened 40 years ago not by members of that nation. In fact, the scientists made the claim in the text that this nation no longer exists, and this is just a study of the remains, and incredibly offensive stuff even at the time. What is amazing about this museum is one of the people who visited that museum as a kid, a fellow by the name of Dave Gogh, went and became the director of the museum, and has put duct tape over the offensive language and has written in beautiful people over the racist language. And I remember him talking through how he initially wanted it all redone in a properly laid out, brand new panels and all of this, and just his incredibly low cost solution that really brought the point much better than I think anyone else could have done it.
Thanks, Ian. That was really useful, and it actually ties in really nicely with another one of the questions that have been asked about how museum design strategies can help poorly resourced museums. And you know, not all our institutions are big nationals, and even those nationals are struggling. But you know, we all work closely with smaller museums, community-led museums, institutions that are local authority museums that have seen their funding decimated over the last 6 months. So that kind of suggestion of low cost budget examples is perhaps a really apt example to talk about there. Ashok, I don't know whether you wanted to say something about your seminal exhibition, or whether you felt that you'd already engaged with that, or whether you wanted to engage with that question about how design strategies can help poorly resourced museums.
Sorry, I didn't get your question. You meant which exhibition were you referring to? So
which exhibition has been seminal in changing your practice, changing the design sector's practice, or the museum sector's practice? But I feel that you spoke to that very beautifully in your presentation. But if you wanted to add anything, then you're of course very welcome.
I think one of the ones that I could mention would be an exhibition called Agri-Expo 1977, when NID was approached to produce a national exhibition in New Delhi, with the brief that we were given by the Ministry of Agriculture to get Indians to understand that the strength of India's civilization comes from the land. Now, that was all the brief that we had, but this huge range of issues that comes up meant that for one entire academic year, every single student of NID and every single teacher, except the foundation students, were busy working on a project. What about agriculture? And they could not fuss and say that they were furniture designers and had nothing to do with agriculture. So what were we doing in New Delhi? Everybody was there and everybody worked. And that was a transformation, not only in the awareness it made that here was the largest source of Indian livelihood that designers were hardly touching, but also the manifold ways in which the exhibition taught us of the roots of design and of culture in this country, in a way that perhaps if we had Mahatma Gandhi still around at that time, he would have been able to explain. But now we were learning hands-on. And years later, some of the exhibits and some of the technologies, quote unquote, that we developed in New Delhi for that exhibition were then carried forward into a permanent exhibition at the Commonwealth Institute. And we wondered whether it would work. It was absolutely phenomenal to see how strongly it did work, and how some of the exhibits that we had not thought were emotionally powerful were bringing tears to the eyes of the Indian diaspora, which came to this exhibition and was telling their children, that's how it was when I was a child. So I think that's one of the most important exhibitions. Another, which is a smaller example, is a designer called Judy Freighter, who spent much of her time in India in a village in Kutch in Western India, here in Gujarat, developed in the villages where she was reviving the embroidery craft, developed a village museum so that the village folk would have direct hands-on contact with their legacy, with their heritage, putting together in a state-of-the-art the state of the art having to be redefined for an area without power, without air conditioning, a desert area, extremes of climate, of what an exhibition and what a museum can be. Was it an exhibition? Is it an exhibition? Is it a museum? It's both. But the ownership is entirely that of the community. And it has been the catalyst for the revival of a craft for which now Kutch is famous and which goes around the world, and which in fact the COVID pandemic has stimulated, because there's now nothing to do except to go and sit in the museum and embroider. I hope that helps you.
Well, actually, it's extremely helpful because you seem to have managed to answer about 10 of the different questions in the Q&A forum in one fell swoop. So well done, especially since we only have a few minutes left. And actually, this has gone incredibly quickly. I was, I should have perhaps allowed a little bit more time. But I think what I'd like to end on is one really pertinent question that goes back to Dinah's original presentation that spoke of the gap between designers and design researchers, and what we could do as designers on the one hand and design researchers on the other hand to narrow that gap. And I think that would be a really useful thing to reflect on just briefly at the end of this discussion, at the end of this conference. So could people just say a little bit about how they think that gap can be narrowed? That would be fantastic. So if we start with Ian, that would be great. And then we go clockwise if you can see you on the screen. And thanks very much.
I yield my time because these people have very interesting things to say.
Oh man, come on. Never mind. Okay. Dinah, do you want to take us next?
Well, I think as I said before, I think a lot of it is to do with money, because we've all made a living out of this game, but I think in the future it's going to be more and more difficult to make a living out of this game. But let's assume that we can make a living out of this game. I think what would be absolutely wonderful is if each design studio had a researcher in it that was not necessarily an historical researcher or even a researcher about the topic, but was a sort of bit of grit. And I remember Will Alsop, the architect, saying he had a sculptor in his studio because the sculptor stopped him making decisions based on taste. And it's something to do with, you know, the kind of the grit in the oyster shell, that somehow there's somebody in there who's so bloody irritating that you want to get shot of them. But nonetheless, they're the person that's really just kicking your ass all the time, you know, and reminding you, you know, don't, you know, yeah, we've been there. Come on, look at this, look at this, look at this, you know. I think that would be great. And maybe we can set up some institution that would hand out grants for funding people like that. So.
Sounds fantastic. Thank you. Tamina, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always talking about the same thing, narrowing the gap between the theory and the practice, the fantastic research that is done on exhibitions and museums, and our practice. And my response to it is actually quite simple, and something that we practice here in Cornwall, where it's a very unusual region. We've got over 70 museums in quite a small area, and they're all tiny. None of them have departments of any description size, but they still manage to be embedded in their communities. And the response is this: you have to talk to each other regularly and often. It doesn't have to be in a formalized sense like a conference, but it's about being self-aware enough to seek out others and knowing they exist, and to be able to, you know, reach out, as it were, and be able to have those conversations and bring the research into the practice, and also for the practice to inform the research, so it's more real world and perhaps less naive. So for my response to almost everything is just please talk to people. If you're constantly just talking to people like yourselves, this gap will not narrow. I had just one tiny thing to add on budgets and exhibitions, and being used to 3-figure budgets for a lot of my more recent work. I won't fill the time now, but if anyone wanted to get in touch, particularly about the pop-up shop stuff we've been doing, I'd be really happy to talk about that. But yeah, just talk to each other more. That will help.
Oh, thank you very much. Ashok, do you want to finish us off, put the nail in the coffin of the conference? Thank you very much.
I don't think I should put a nail in the coffin, but let me just recall something that happened when that wonderful 120-year-old museum in Calcutta was told it was not going to get any grants. For the first time, one heard citizens of Calcutta say, including the Chief Minister, that our soul is in this museum. I don't think anybody in New Delhi cared because they haven't written any checks. But that phrase that was used for the first time gave me a sense that there's something so fundamental and wonderful and beautiful about this practice that we need to treasure it and give it a value that has eluded it for all these years.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Can I just add one little thing, Claire? I mean, I remember one of the rather wonderful things about the Craft Museum in Delhi, which I remember seeing, is this sense of this thing of Emilio Ambaz's thing of looking back to look forward, really, that there is the story, there is the history, and here are people making new things, which are completely part of that single thread running through, which is very moving, I think, and works terribly well. It's very special.
Fantastic, thank you. What a wonderful note to end on, to think about. And actually what's really struck me in the last hour is thinking about the emotions of exhibition design and of museums more broadly. And actually that's been a theme throughout the conference that's been led by our wonderful keynotes as well, in terms of the things that they were talking about in their work. So extremely apt to end on that. And it just remains for me to say how grateful I am to our fantastic speakers, and our amazing audience, who were super productive in the Q&As in the end. And I'm sorry that we didn't manage to get to all of them, but as I said in my notes, I hope that we can take some of those up in post-conference planning, because they're all really, really good questions. So thank you very much. Have a lovely weekend. And as you know, some of the papers will remain live over the weekend, so you can enjoy those with your glass of wine this evening. Take care. Thank you very much.
Thank you.